Is it about changing the problem that's right in
Or is
front
it
of
your
you?
generation's time?
Let's find out.
So when I was a kid growing up in Australia, I had big ideas. I had big hair, and I had very big ideas. I really wanted to change the world. And I had some very specific ideas about how I was going to do it, as you'll see in this video.
We spoke to Jeremy Heimans at his Sydney home.
When we are in power, in 10 or 20 years or 30 years, we may not have a world to inherit. We may not have a world to improve. If we do not have a safe environment and an environment restored to a normal condition, so global devastation, demilitarisation, third world debt.
If you were our Prime Minister, how would you be tackling these problems?
Well, I'd start with, making sure that children's voices are heard.
He represented Australia at the Voice of the Children Summit in Holland last year. He also produced a documentary, The Power of Peace, which he presented to our own Prime Minister, Mr. Hawke, Jeremy Heimans.
So, so maybe I was just a little bit precocious, just a little bit. A bit of a bundle of joy to my confused parents. But here I am with Bob Hawke. Bob Hawke was the Prime Minister of Australia, the most powerful person in Australia. And I thought that if I was going to get my ambitious agenda of change achieved, then the thing that I had to do in life was figure out how to become Bob Hawke, how to become Prime Minister. And everybody around me, a lot of adults, thought that that's what I should do as well and encouraged me to do it. And so I figured that my future was to work hard and take all of the steps within those institutions to eventually become Prime Minister. And I figured that when I did, that things would be easy. Then I could make these sweeping changes. Those environmental laws that I was going to pass that were going to, solve the climate change problem. I was reasonably confident that if I got to that role, well, clearly, in that role as Prime Minister, I'd be able to do some pretty big stuff. So when I was 21, I still kind of believed that big institutions like this could make big change. And I went to the UN. I still cared about that same set of issues that I did when I was 12. And so I thought I'll go to the United Nations and I'll figure out how do we solve these big global problems. I'll learn from what's going on there. And maybe eventually I'll become an official at the United Nations. And what I found at the UN was a little bit more like a Kafka novel than it was like an experience of change. I discovered that the institution was so big and so complex that the people in it were primed to be so cautious that it was very difficult to get anything done. There were a lot of people expressing a view, and we were bringing the nations of the world together to kind of share their opinions, but it wasn't a place to get big, radical change done. So in 2002, I went to the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard. And I thought, okay, still believe that maybe I could reform institutions like the United Nations from the inside. And I went there, which is this place that future leaders get trained, future politicians, future public servants go to learn about leadership. And so I was there, and I took a really interesting class. And it was a class called Leadership, but it was actually a class that challenged a lot of the assumptions that I'd had about leadership. And this class made an interesting distinction between being a leader and having real leadership, which was all about the ability to create disruptive change, and having authority, and what it meant to have a big title and a big role. And we're sitting in class, and we're doing this around the circle thing where the teacher has said, talk about your biggest leadership failure. And people were going around in the circle, and they said, well, in my university student government, this happened, and this didn't go very well. And then this guy's turn comes, and he said, I was the president of Ecuador, and I was removed from power in a military coup. And everybody was like, okay. So this man, Jamil Mahuad, was president of his country. And what he tried to do in the year 2000 was implement huge sweeping economic reforms that he thought were good for his country and that were designed to change the currency and a whole bunch of other key ways about how the economy worked. He announced these plans with big fanfare, and within a week, he'd been deposed and thrown out of power in a military coup. He'd threatened a lot of powerful interests. This isn't a problem that just occurs in Ecuador. This is President Obama. President Obama, I believe, is in power for the right reasons. He wants to make really big change. But this is the environment that President Obama faces. Look at the world that he faces. Corporations will spend millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars, to fight big changes that he proposes. His own party will do that. A filibuster, an ancient set of regulations and laws, are being used to block big change at almost any costs. His own donor base makes it very difficult for him to enact big changes. So he operates in a world in which he's kind of deeply constrained. He has huge ambitions to change the country, and he's changed some big things. But the ability of any modern president to make sweeping changes is sadly very, very limited indeed. So back home, back in Australia, it's 2005. I'm a little older and wiser now, and I face a situation that I really want to change. This man, John Howard, is in power. Unlike Bob Hawke, I'm not a big fan of John Howard. He's a guy who's, in my view, changed the country and taken it back 30 years. He's refusing to apologise to Indigenous Australians for the historic injustices that had been perpetrated upon them. He's not taking any action on climate change and not signing the Kyoto Protocol. He's locking up refugees in effectively what are desert prisons while their applications are being processed. So I'm like, how do we change this? And I felt very passionately about it, along with David Madden, the guy that created this organisation with me. So we're sitting around thinking, what do we do? The established political parties, the institutions that are supposed to provide an effective opposition to him, are just hopeless. They're not doing it. People don't believe in them, people aren't excited about participating in them, and he'd already been in power for 9 years. Meanwhile, something very interesting was happening, which was that technology was making it dramatically easier to create political change, not from the inside, not as the leader of the opposition in Australia, but as an outsider. Technology meant that very quickly and very easily, you could mobilize huge numbers of people and create a social movement that you couldn't before. So I decided with David to do just that. We decided to create an organization called GetUp. It wasn't a political party. In fact, it was the opposite of a political party. You didn't have to pay money to join. You didn't have to commit to a long manifesto to be part of it. But you did have to be someone who wanted to participate directly in changing the country. So when we started the organization, we obviously just didn't really have a movement, but we put this TV ad together, we made it. We said Australians are starting a new movement. And the only members of the movement really were my sister and my niece, who starred in the television ad. They were great. And so the first action that we asked people to take was very simple. We said, okay, government officials, members of parliament, should be held accountable to their citizens. So we said, citizens, write directly to your members of parliament. We made it really easy using technology to do it, which hadn't been done before in Australia, and tell them that you'll hold them to account and write to them personally about the issues you care about. So we did this, and it was an amazing response. Because something like this hadn't been done in Australia before, people felt really empowered by the opportunity to do this in such an easy way. They didn't have to write a letter anymore. They could write an email, and they could find their member of parliament. And within a few days, tens of thousands of people had done this. Now, as you can imagine, the government of Prime Minister John Howard were not so impressed. A government minister went on national television and he said, there are hundreds of emails arriving in senators' offices. They're beside themselves just to clear the screen. This is highly irresponsible. This is spam. This is spam. And so, as you can imagine, ordinary Australians, tens of thousands of them, who'd taken the time to do what they thought they were entitled to do, which was write to their members of parliament, were a little outraged by this government minister describing their own behaviour as irresponsible. And so a movement was born. This is GetUp today, just 6 years later. The largest political group in the country with more members than all of the political parties put together. And what's inspiring about GetUp is it isn't just people clicking on their computers, signing online petitions. It's people all over the country meeting up, taking action, dressing up their dogs in GetUp t-shirts, and acting on the issues that they're passionate about to build a more progressive country. And I'm proud to say that GetUp has helped to change elections and played a role in the 2007 election where John Howard was chucked out of office. in changing big laws in the country, including laws about refugees, and in even changing the constitution in Australia by getting our members to launch a lawsuit that challenged the constitutionality of laws that were preventing young people from voting. And so GetUp has had a really big impact, and having done that, then decided to go back to those global issues that I cared about. Got together with some other people from around the world and tried to solve a problem that we felt existed at the global level, and not via the UN. So instead of going back to the UN, decided to create a different kind of organization that was designed to solve this problem. And the problem that you see up on the screen is a problem which is the basic imbalance of power at the global level, which is that governments have all sorts of institutions like the UN, the World Bank, the IMF, etc., through which to coordinate. Multinational corporations are by their nature multinational, and they are very powerfully organized globally. But ordinary people don't have a voice. So we decided to create an organization called Avaz to make global public opinion the new superpower, and to get ordinary people back involved in international decisions that actually affect the lives of billions of people. And I don't understate that. And so Avaz today has 7.4 million members in every country on Earth, and it operates in 14 languages. And this picture is a picture of Avaz at work. In Brazil, people organized to pass a law to pressure the government and the parliament to pass a law to prevent corrupt public officials from running for parliament again, as they were doing in Brazil. So you'd get into public office, you'd be corrupt, you'd get charged, you'd get out of jail, and then you'd go right back in. And so this law stopped that because 2 million people in Brazil were mobilized to do it. So unwittingly, and I didn't have a word for this at the time, I'd gone from someone who thought he was going to end up in politics to becoming a movement entrepreneur. What's a movement entrepreneur? A movement entrepreneur is someone who uses technology as an outsider from those institutions to create new sources of power by aggregating and mobilizing the voices of many, by going straight back to the people. So if you're interested in becoming a movement entrepreneur, here are a few thoughts about how you can approach your own journey in making this kind of change. The first thing I'd say is whatever you do, make sure that you don't become institutionalized. You need institutions. Institutions can give you funding for the work that you do. They're very important interlocutors in making change because ultimately there are key decision makers within governments and other large institutions. But don't allow yourself to be captured by them. Remember that small groups of passionate people who are nimble and lean and who have autonomy and the ability to say no are actually in many ways more powerful than being seduced by acceptance and reward from those big institutions. Secondly, build a movement, not a cult of personality. You'll note that in many of the movements that have occurred recently in the Arab world, there was no big charismatic leader which produced the change. And in the 21st century, because of technology, it's possible to have movements that are largely leaderless, that do not depend on one individual charismatic figure. So don't build the movement around you, because if you do, then when something goes wrong with you, when people lose faith in you, where somehow it all depends on you, the whole movement doesn't fall apart. Thirdly, a movement is not an internet meme. It's very easy these days to get intoxicated by technology and to get lots of people very excited about an issue. But what you need to do is make sure that you don't just do that, you don't have a YouTube hit and 10 million people see the video, but no real strategy to influence the issue that you care about. So I would encourage you not to build internet memes and to create organizations that are about movement building for the long term. And to take the idea not just of technology, but also old-fashioned face-to-face very seriously. Because the best movements still have people dressing up their dogs in t-shirts. So this is a sea of issues that the world faces. You might care about any number of them, or maybe one of those issues isn't in this sea of issues. You might care about bullying, you might care about gay rights, you might care about HIV/AIDS, you might care about global poverty. Whatever issue you care about, here's my advice to you. Disband that presidential exploratory committee. Decide instead to take a more difficult path. It's not one in which the rewards are as obvious, where it's as clear what the path to success is, where the title doesn't define your nominal power, where ultimately you have to make tough decisions because you choose to be on the outside, mobilizing institutional power, but remaining yourself fundamentally someone who is not part of those structures. And I'd encourage you in the 21st century, with the tools that we now have, with your ability to remain free and smart and creative and nimble and lean, to take all of those assets and to try big radical change that 20th century institutions will struggle to do, and to go and become one of those movement entrepreneurs, to do something even more ambitious than being president. Aim higher and see where it gets you.